Okay. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear? Okay. Thank you. Thanks for coming. And I'm here to. My name is Laura Kurgan, and I teach in the architecture school, as well as run a mapping and visualization lab. And I'm here to introduce these two incredible women. So first, Naomi Klein. She's here to talk about her new book, This Changes Everything. I don't have your book, Kate, to hold up. But so she's here in New York at the tail end of the climate march and is on the board of 350.org, the organization that started it, which is not hard to talk about, so so close to the aftermath. And I know that a lot of students here participated in the march, and so today is a great day to reflect on that amazing event which drew such an unprecedented crowd. The organizational structure of the march is close to my own interpretation of these issues, which I know both of the speakers share very closely today, that those countries, people, technology, corporations, and modernization maybe, that are most responsible for climate change are the least affected by it. And it's that ethical dilemma that I think we'll focus on today. So far, they haven't been affected by it. So this diagram of the march, can we show the diagram? Huh? Where? Okay. There's no nothing. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so the diagram of the march, which hopefully will appear on the screen, is really was such an impressive moment, I think, in the organization of the march, and makes it really clear what is at stake, especially who was on the front line were the people that are most affected by climate change. So Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, and author of New York Times #1 bestseller, The Shock Doctrine, Rise of Disaster Capitalism, which was published in 2007. And she's also the author, that's how I came to know her, No Logo, Taking Aim at Brand Bullies, and was also an international bestseller. I'm not going to go into details on a bio because it'll take all day, but I encourage you to go to www.naomiklein.org. So Kate Orff is going to talk about her book, Petrochemical America, which was published actually last year, but is now published in paperback, much less expensive and equally as beautiful. Kate is an associate professor at Columbia University, where she teaches graduate design studios and interdisciplinary seminars focused on sustainable development, biodiversity, and community-based change. She also runs a super successful landscape architecture practice called GSAPP. The thing about Kate is that she practices what she teaches and is an inspirational activist with determination like none other to get her work built, and most importantly on her own terms, which in her case means to mitigate climate change and build resilient things and engage community. She is best known on this front for what she calls oyster texture, which has been exhibited at MoMA, and is also one of the finalists to be funded as a project called Living Breakwaters for Rebuild by Design competition, an initiative of the Hurricane Sandy Building Task Force in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. GSAPP's project is constructed for the most part out of oyster beds, so we're looking forward to seeing what emerges out of this project because it's a major milestone for GSAPP. So Naomi writes often about 3 pillars of our neoliberal era. She did this in No Logo and Shock Doctrine as well. And the 3 things are, and it's a quotation from her book on page 72, privatization of the public sphere, deregulation of the corporate sector, and lowering of income and corporate taxes paid with cuts to corporate spending are each compatible with many of the actions we must take to bring our missions to safe levels. No easy task. So profit and the environment in her book, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about this today from her today, Kate's Petrochemical America maps the human and environmental and health costs of the oil industry within a specific territory of a time. Kate's book is super important, providing us with a granular scale example. But the question remains for the two of them, how do corporate forces, detailed in Naomi's book, alter the landscape and create conditions for the Cancer Alley, which Kate, delineates so well in her book? What's happening there? Kate's book can be read as a case study full of what Naomi details in hers, and we need many, many more case studies like Kate's book because of the urgency of what Naomi inspires as activism in her book. So without further ado, I have some questions which I can ask at the end, but I'm going to leave it to these two amazing women, and Naomi first.
We were maybe going to start just with showing this quick little book trailer we threw together. Is that doable? If not, it's no big deal. It's just like a 2-minute thing. Book trailer? Okay. Moment of silence, followed by loud noises.
There we go. In December 2012, a complex systems scientist walked up to the podium at the American Geophysics Union to present a paper. It was titled, "Is Earth Fucked?" His answer was, yeah, pretty much. That's where the road we're on is taking us. But that has less to do with carbon than it does with capitalism. Our economic model is at war with life on Earth. We can't change the laws of nature, but we can change our broken economy. And that's why climate change isn't just a disaster. It's also our best chance to demand and build a better world. Change or be changed. But make no mistake, this changes everything.
Okay. All right. So thanks for that wonderful introduction, Laura and Kate. I'm really excited about your book and just the way our projects complement each other. It's really great to have this forum. I'm going to borrow your watch so that I stay on schedule. So the title, as you saw from the trailer, This Changes Everything, this is climate change. And the reason why I chose that title, it was tough to come up with a title for the project. We went through a whole bunch of them. And ultimately landed on this one because I feel like one of the things you want from a book title is you want it to start the conversation where it should start. And I think it provides a really good starting point for the debates that we need to have about climate at this point, where we are in the crisis. Where we are is that there really aren't any non-radical solutions in front of us. And that is because we have waited so long to address this crisis. We've known, scientists have known for many decades, the rest of us lost all plausible deniability in the late 1980s when James Hansen testified before Congress that he had a high degree of certainty that there was a connection between CO2 emissions and warming. At that point, 87% of Americans knew what global warming was. It was so mainstream that that year, when the editors of Time magazine needed to choose their man of the year, and they still called it a man of the year, they chose Planet Earth. So that was the year that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed. That was the year that the first intergovernmental high-level meeting was held about emission reductions. It was held in Toronto, the city where I live. And every major government was represented, all the top scientists. They came up with an emission reduction trajectory. This ultimately led to the signing of the UN Climate Convention in 1990, and that ultimately led to the Kyoto Protocol. So, since our governments, there's this amazing speech by a young person that was given at a climate summit a couple of years ago in Durban, South Africa. Her name is Anjali Appadura. She was 21 at the time. She stood representing all youth. There's only one youth spokesperson allowed per UN summit. And she said, "You have been negotiating all my life." And since these negotiations began in 1990, emissions have gone up by 61%. Okay? Now, that is why there are no non-radical options left on the table, because there is what Michael Mann, who's one of our leading climate scientists, he's at Penn State University, he wrote a very famous book called The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars. He calls it the procrastination penalty. The procrastination penalty is basically that because of the nature of greenhouse gases, because carbon sticks around for a couple hundred years trapping heat, if you don't act quickly, if you keep emitting and indeed increase your emissions as we're doing every year, then you need to then if you're going to avert catastrophic warming, you need to do so very, very quickly. So the landscape in which we're working is different than the one in which our predecessors were working when they started talking about this crisis. So this changes everything, because if we stay on the road we're on, everything changes about our physical world. Then this is what our most conservative institutions are now telling us. Not only 97% of climate scientists are saying that climate change is real, but now we have really staid establishment institutions like the World Bank, the International Energy Agency, telling us that what they call business as usual, which means just keep on keeping on, don't do anything, just keep doing what you're doing, which will lead to emission increases year after year, puts us on a warming trajectory of between 4 and 6 degrees. That's Celsius. So 6 degrees is more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit over pre-industrial levels. Okay. That is a level of warming that the models don't account for. Scientists find it impossible to predict. But it's past the point where we know we're going to see quite dramatic sea level rise. We know we're going to see whole cities disappear under the waves. Also countries, small island states, large parts of Bangladesh. We know we're talking about huge levels of crop failure because of drought. And this is, just at 4 degrees, let alone 6 degrees. So everything changing about our physical world. And you've heard these scary scenarios before. In order to prevent those scary scenarios, we also have some very radical technological solutions on the table, like geoengineering. Increasingly, we're hearing talk of deliberate interventions in the climate system to try to prevent the most catastrophic outcomes, like spraying sulfur into the stratosphere to reflect more of the sun's heat back to space, or fertilizing the oceans. So that's a radical scenario. And then what I'm arguing in the book is we can avert those radical scenarios only if we're willing to consider radical economic and political changes. But the idea that we can sort of tweak this with gentle market mechanisms that you won't even notice, that everything can be win-win, that it can be very gradual and painless for everybody, that ship has sailed. We are now looking at, if we're going to stay within our global carbon budget, and we're going to embrace the principle of equity that Laura referred to earlier, and is in fact enshrined in the UN Climate Convention that all of our governments have signed, including the US government, amazingly enough. And the principle is called common but differentiated responsibility. A common but differentiated responsibility basically says the countries that got a 200-year head start on emitting carbon and grew wealthy in the process and opened up a wealth divide between the global north and the global south have to lead this process to create atmospheric space for poorer countries to pull themselves out of poverty, and also to help those countries leapfrog over fossil fuels and go straight to renewable energy and other green tech. So that's technology transfers and also wealth transfers. And we've been hearing a little bit about this in the context of the UN summit. Will there be climate financing is the discourse. So if we are going to stay within our carbon budget and leave ourselves a 50-50 chance of keeping warming below what our governments have told us is dangerous levels, and they have designated dangerous levels at 2 degrees Celsius warming. That is a controversial target, considering we are only at 0.7, 0.8, and we're already seeing extreme changes to our climate. There's big debates about whether pushing it to 2 degrees is reckless, but nonetheless, this is what our governments agreed to in Copenhagen in 2009. So if we are going to stick to that, then we need to be cutting our emissions by between 8 and 10% a year, according to leading climate scientists. And that's where you start getting into a direct conflict with the fundamental logic at the heart of our economic system, which is unfettered growth. It's not that we can't grow parts of our economy in order to respond to this crisis. Indeed, we must. We have to roll out this energy transformation. We need to invest massively in the public sphere in order to get off fossil fuels and to protect ourselves from the storms that are already locked in. But at the same time, we have to contract parts of our economy that are fueling this crisis. And obviously that means fossil fuels, but it also means talking about demand, energy demand, and just mindless consumption. And part of the reason for that is that you have to burn fossil fuels to get off fossil fuels. So in the short term, if we embrace this ambitious emission reduction trajectory and roll out the kind of transformations that are required to get off fossil fuels, we're actually going to burn a lot of carbon because our economies are built on fossil fuels now. So in the short term, we spike our emissions in order to get to that better place. And that's why we have to be talking about having some of these more difficult and challenging discussions about where we're going to contract and how we're going to reduce demand in the wealthy world. So those are a few of the more inconvenient truths than Al Gore told you about. And the thesis around why we have so far failed to rise to this challenge, I'm telling a kind of alternate history about that is not having to do with many of the rationales we often hear, like we're too selfish, we're too greedy, this seems like a far-off abstract goal, we only respond to immediate threats. We often hear we're incapable of international cooperation, the UN is too complex. We hear all of these theories, right? So, in the book I kind of go through them one by one and talk about, yeah, they all have some truth to them, but there are also historical precedents that prove otherwise, that we do come together in crisis. We've come together during depressions, world wars. We have sacrificed. Indeed, we still sacrifice in the name of abstract goals like balancing budgets, austerity. we are capable of coming together. And I would argue that climate change is less and less of an abstract, far-off threat, especially in a city like New York post-Sandy. And I think that that was one of the things that was really clear in that march, was that a lot of people marching, particularly from communities like Red Hook and the Rockaways, are not seeing climate change as a grandchildren issue or far-off abstract issue. This came knocking on their doors, as it did really for everyone in the city, but of course it didn't affect everybody equally, because inequality impacts how we weather these storms. So the bad timing, the argument I'm making is that, human nature accounts for some of it, and the complexity of international cooperation accounts for some of it. But then again, our governments have cooperated on nuclear weapons treaties, on ozone depletion, and they managed in the same time period to build a global trading system that is quite complex, and has penalties attached to it and binding rules, unlike the climate treaties that have been so far adopted. So what I argue is that what explains our inaction the most is incredibly bad timing. So coming back to that 1988 moment when James Hansen testifies, when planet Earth is on the cover of Time, let's ask ourselves what else was going on in that time period. That was the year the first free trade deal was signed between Canada and the US. The next year, the Berlin Wall collapsed. Francis Fukuyama declared history over. It was the triumphant moment for a vision of the world that Joseph Stiglitz describes as market fundamentalism. And Laura gave a little précis of the ideological pillars of this project: privatization, deregulation, cuts to the corporate sector paid for, tax cuts to the corporate sector paid for, and service cuts to regular people. And of course, free trade deals. So the problem of timing is that many of the tools that were needed to deal with this crisis slipped out of our collective hands at precisely the moment when we needed them most. When we most needed the power to regulate polluters, regulation was treated as a dirty word. When we most needed to invest in the public sphere, everything was about budget cuts and austerity. But I think even more critically, and relating to the work that many of you are doing and studying, is the way in which the very idea of planning, of public planning, became synonymous basically with communism. You don't plan an economy, you don't plan in response to crisis, you leave that to the market. So the way we have responded to this crisis has been within the boundaries essentially of laissez-faire logic, right? Which is why rather than regulating polluters, the first idea was to set up carbon markets for polluters so that they could trade and find ways to profit. And instead of shutting down a coal plant, here you would let it keep going and offset its emissions in a forest in Indonesia or something like that. And also it had to do with the kinds of responses that a lot of the big green groups went to first. Much of them were individualistic consumer responses, rather than talking about collective action, because in this period collective action was very much under siege. It was all about what you buy, what you shop, and actually it became this kind of shopping extravaganza for various green goods. And in a weird way, a lot of these responses actually reinforced the values and the ideology that has been at the heart of our failed response and non-response. So I think this is changing. That while the crisis landed on our laps at the worst possible moment, the kind of do or die moment, where we have this small window where it is still not too late to prevent catastrophic warming, but it requires that we confront the incredible political and financial power of the fossil fuel lobby. That is coming at a time when this ideological project, to a large degree, stands in tatters. It still has our elites captured. I was at the UN, spent the day at the UN yesterday at the UN summit, and the model in which our governments and leading corporations are talking about responding to this crisis is still all voluntary. They basically are holding a telethon for planet Earth. They're coming together, no, I pledge this, I'll save the oceans, whatever. It's this hodgepodge response that, frankly, the people involved in it clearly do not believe is going to get us anywhere near where we need to go. So they're backsliding over there. I think the good news is not just that there were 400,000 people in the streets of New York on Sunday, but that so many of those people understand, as that one of the lines in that diagram shows. They know who the enemy is. They know who's trying to stop progress. It isn't this sort of we are all in this together and it's just a question of educating people anymore. There's a much greater awareness of power and money, and that's why the day after the march there was a sit-in on Wall Street called Flood Wall Street. I'm sure some of you saw it. Maybe some of you went there. The other thing that I think has really changed is that I think the perspective of the climate movement, one of the things I write about in the book, is that the logo of the climate change movement for so long was the same logo as the environmental movement since the 1970s, which was the planet as seen from space, which is the perspective of either an astronaut or a god, because who else gets to see the planet from way up above? And that there was a disconnection and an abstraction from actual places where these the impacts of these policies are playing out. And what moved me most about the march on Sunday was the way in which it was a convergence, a coming together of so many communities that are directly impacted both by climate change and also who are on the front lines of this toxic energy model, because they have a refinery in their backyards and their kids have asthma, because they're ranchers and the Keystone XL pipeline would run through their land, because they're indigenous people from Alberta and they're downstream from the tar sands and their communities have very high cancer rates, or communities like Red Hook and Far Rockaways that were hit so hard by not just Hurricane Sandy, but also the neglected public sphere and the failed public response. So what I see happening is a growing understanding that the response to this crisis can actually tackle the greatest economic crisis that we face, which is also the legacy of this ideological project, which is deep and deepening inequality. And an understanding that in rising to this threat, there's the best opportunity to build not just healthier communities, but fairer ones as well. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion afterwards to talk in particular about the role that you as design and architecture students can play, because I think it's a really important one, in supporting communities that see a lot of hope in this transition and aren't getting the support they need to turn that hope into real plans. Because the desire is really there and there's something shifting, and it's a very powerful shift. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. I'm going to also look. Okay. Here comes my, is this one in the back? Orff? Yeah. Okay, so I sort of titled my talk, This Change is Design, with apologies to your jacket designer, book jacket designer, because I believe really deeply and that design and planning has a huge role in the thesis of her book. And I really want to try to talk about, in GSAPP, there's so many different ways that faculty, students, and departments are starting to tackle climate change and engage climate change. There's too many to categorize. So I'm just going to talk about two projects in my own work and just describe what it is and how we've tried to sort of engage these issues. The first one is, number one, we are visualizers. We can conceptualize the issues. We can connect the dots. And so that's really what my book, Petrochemical America, is about. Secondly, we can adapt and engage, understand the world as it is, and engage people in a process that is a sort of change-oriented process. And that, for that, I'm going to talk about living breakwaters. And finally, envision and sort of design the world as we want it to be, right? So how can we imagine new energy landscapes? And what are the impacts of these new energy landscapes? How can we decarbonize our settlement patterns and move forward? So Petrochemical America, this is a book with Richard Misrach. It's also a traveling exhibition. And in this book, I really tried to pull together, and as Naomi does in her book, how all of these crises are somehow interrelated, right? So this is a book that traces and maps the American landscape as a machine for consuming oil and petrochemicals, and understands cycles of extraction, consumption, waste, and displacement, and offers, finally, a kind of alternative models, policies, and visions to transition away from fossil fuels. So where to begin with such a book? Well, this was a collaboration with the photographer Richard Misrach, but it really began with a kind of a research process. So, we're not, studying super colliders. Research in kind of the design world is like going to sites, putting your eyes on reality, interviewing people, and trying to understand and reveal, literally, connections between people and the landscapes. This is an image of me and my sort of team staring from a graveyard to a ethylene plant. So here's the site, right? Every good landscape architect, you focus on a place in the world. This is the place. It is between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Let's see if I have a pointer. Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And so we did a kind of a deep dive into this place that's also been called Cancer Alley. There's over 130 petrochemical plants and oil refiners in the zone. So Richard Misrach photographed this area, and his photographs remind me of one of Naomi's statements, like living in a planet that is dying. He began to photograph people, landscapes, and in his photographs you can see many themes of individual and industry, pollution. This is a cloud, which is a toxic cloud. It's an artificial cloud of pollution above the Norco chemical refinery. It shows the sort of landscapes of waste and landscapes of consumption. This is the Mississippi River. The sort of nighttime pollution, the pollution that occurs in these operational landscapes that we think of as outside of the city. This school has a kind of like sort of a blind spot relative to the physical extents of the city. The city is the countryside, not just Manhattan. And the notion of how larger scale environmental crises have all become intertwined and have played out in a very particular way in this region. This is Richard's kind of quintessential photograph of Cancer Alley, of Dow Chemical in the background, of a town called Taft that was moved in the foreground. The cemetery remains. So this is a kind of a chapter map of the book where I move from oil to talk about infrastructure, waste, displacement, ecology, food, and then back to the landscape that we have made, and really try to pull together how ecology and food are kind of put on this one-way extractive process of, extracting natural gas, turning it into fertilizer, dumping it on our soil and crops, which then become, need more fertilizer for them to even be productive, which creates vast wastelands in not only our landscapes, but in our water bodies and so on. So the book also tries to kind of indicate how, if you can map and if you can draw a cognitive, map of how power and control and ideology and money have been intertwined, you can also then kind of try to understand how to break those cycles. So the end of the book is called The Glossary of, and it sort of shines a spotlight on people and laws and other ways that change has been made. But back to the photograph. This is one of Richard's photographs. I kind of feel like, is this a photograph of the beginning of the universe or the end of the universe? I'm not sure. But how the book worked is I began to take his photographs, sequence them, and write about them, and write about my own experience and incorporate this into kind of a project that is jointly intuitive and research-driven. This is a map of the first chapter, which is called Oil, in which I can trace the evolution of and try to describe why the lower Mississippi is sort of ground zero for or was at least, for chemical and oil extraction, and overlaid on top of that a map of carbon emissions. And you can see the age of oil is the thickness of this little dot, this little dotted line, and we're here, up at almost 400 parts per million. So to put that in almost in a sort of geological standpoint. Sorry, this is not very good. The chapter also traces the sort of how the extraction of oil and the complexity relative to that basically beget the modern corporation, and how that modern corporation evolved over time, how we're digging deeper into the earth to extract more and more oil, and how this kind of cycle and trajectory of extraction has also engendered incredible cycle of consumption. And you can see, Naomi, I know in your book you had mentioned like 1970 as this pivotal moment. Like the graph, even when President Jimmy Carter gave his kind of speech about consumption, the graph continues to climb precipitously. So, but back to the site. This is an amazing place if you're an engineer. I'm a daughter of engineers. This is a map of all of the sort of chemicals and petrochemical products that are manufactured in Cancer Alley. It's really an incredible map, right? It's inspiring, like ingenious in a way. But then as a mother, it's also terrifying, right? Atrazine, vinyl chloride, all of these things that you do not want in your body, in your children's bodies. And so the book also traces the sort of waste landscape, right? Because we live in an ecological system, right? So waste lives in the landscape, it lives in our bodies, and so we track how these chemicals move through the sort of hybrid infrastructure of the natural and artificial infrastructure of the Mississippi Delta. This is, for example, an ethylene plant. Ethylene goes in the pipe. Up the other side, you have these sort of feedstock products that lead to the ubiquitous plastic bag. It's literally a one-way extraction and waste cycle. We did a lot of research into how these things are made, and this final sort of drawing of the infrastructure chapter is really, to me, like this map of addiction, right? So this is a drawing of all of the sort of oil platforms, derricks, and the pipes that are connecting back into Louisiana, right? And then so during the writing of this book, Deepwater Horizon exploded and sent barrels and barrels of oil spewing into the Gulf of Mexico. We mapped its extent, but I think based on that sort of my research, Deepwater Horizon just seemed like anomalous only in terms of its size, because there are many, many other waste incidents that happened and infrastructural accidents that became just part of business as usual. So the next chapter is about waste and how waste lives in our bodies. It is stored in our bodies, make no mistake. And this is a map of toxic releases in the Baton Rouge, New Orleans corridors. And it also describes cancer clusters, clusters of infertility, clusters of other serious ailments. And if you look closely, you can see really, really very disturbing proximities. For example, in Gonzales, there was a rabidosarcoma. There are lots of incidents of stillbirths, et cetera. And you can see these are self-reported data from the corporations of chemicals that were dumped in the area, right? So what does that even mean? So, I think, toxic landscape, toxic body, right? So I was pregnant when I wrote this book, and I think what's really important is to be able to understand and really have a better understanding of literally how the toxic suite of chemicals that we find in our landscape and that we've all benefited from in our many products that we use every day, how these chemicals live in the body and have reciprocal effects, of which many are even unknown at this point, including endocrine disruption. We also looked in great detail at how communities were displaced, locally, began to learn stories, collect anecdotes, and compile specific sort of case studies of individuals and communities that were displaced by, in this case, Morrison by Dow Chemical, and then began to compile these for an overall kind of story about the entire region. And these stories had never really been compiled in one place. We also learned how, this phenomena is literally being mirrored on a global scale, and began to look and see from places as diverse as the Niger Delta to Vapi, India, about how this sort of toxic landscape of extraction is displacing large and particularly vulnerable populations. From an ecological standpoint, that first image I showed of Richard is right here, called Requiem for a Bayou. It's incredible to try to really see and literally put your eyes on reality to see how these kind of incredibly rich, looped, living cycles of cypress swamps have been turned within the scale of literally half of a generation, the time scale of half a generation, into ghostly poles due to this sort of combined effects of sea level rise, salinization, sinking ground, and of course, the soup of chemicals that I've just described. I looked at a Gulf scale about how these looped and living kind of aquaculture systems created this very rich economy in Louisiana, and how that economy itself has been stopped. And this is a map of land loss in Louisiana and the increasing kind of vulnerability of this place to increasing hurricane activity, sea level rise, and wetland loss. And a zoom into the Louisiana offshore oil port. And, you know, the Mississippi River and Delta itself is, at least was, the home for incredible diversity of species. It's an incredibly important ecological corridor, and many sort of incredible biodiversity is at risk. In the food chapter, we look very much at how the contrast between the synthetic nitrogen cycle, the sort of organic nitrogen cycle, and the synthetic nitrogen cycle, to understand how, you know, soil is actually kind of part of a looped process that involves decomposition. It's a process that's embedded in life, and rather, in contrast to the industrialized nitrogen cycle, this is a cycle that results in, you know, water quality degradation and pollution. This creates a kind of amazing condition in the heartland of America, where we have this literally like a Faustian bargain. This is a map of the Mississippi River Delta watershed. Everything here is labeled, these colors are atrazine and nitrogen, and how we've created a kind of literal Faustian bargain where in the Midwest we have kind of dumped these you know, chemicals on our crops in a kind of a monoculture situation, and we've replaced sort of rich sources of protein like omegas and that have been part of our sort of seafood resources of the Mississippi Delta, and we've replaced those in the American diet with a kind of a monoculture of corn and soybean. So to me, it's a real story that needs to be told, and it's a sort of a mapping and a sort of a projection about how we may be able to intervene in these situations. And so the book concludes with a chapter called Landscape, literally the landscape we have made, and about how we're living in bigger and bigger houses, farther and farther apart, consuming more energy to not only drive between the places where we live, worship, and go to school, but also we need to fill these bigger houses with more and more petrochemical products. And finally, it concludes with literally kind of a map of America, and this kind of basic thesis that the lines are changing, right? Because of climate change, we have sea level rise, we have coastal storm surge, we have desertification, and the point is, you know, as planners and landscape architects, can we draw these lines deliberately? I mean, can we sort of understand our role in redrawing these lines? A quick snapshot of the glossary of terms and solutions, and how we begin to try to, you know, shine spotlight on different people, agencies, and so on who are making change, and begin to kind of draw connections and collaborations between them. All right, so that's the cognitive map of the climate change landscape. And so this second project I want to show is how to adapt and how to engage and how to live sort of in the world that we are now and try to change it at the same time. So this is called Living Breakwaters. It's a project that's about, you know, came about after Sandy, and it's proposed as a sort of a chain of breakwaters off the south shore of Staten Island that's in combination with onshore sand dunes and programming, especially in the form of schools and communities. So this project was, you know, the result of a huge regional study that I can't go into, But it also was also the result of a study. My office worked very closely with the Bloomberg administration on kind of trying to think about the New York region after Sandy. And so this is the zone, the location of my project here. And, you know, this is a picture of the project. This is not even during a hurricane event, okay? So this is just a regular day. We have sea level rise in the New York region of projected to be greater than 30 inches by 2050. We have increasing wave action and storm surge, and we have an incredible density of people living along our shoreline. So this is a map of Staten Island's vulnerabilities with many, many acres lost to erosion, more projected, and wave action coming through the New York Bight. We've lost roads, cliffs are eroding, beaches are eroding, basic, you know, infrastructure is failing. Even temporary measures seem completely inadequate, right? And these temporary measures often block people from the water, which seems to be the absolute wrong thing to do, right? Because you're literally further shielding people from an environmental context in which they need to be able to understand and react to and perceive to reduce risk. So this project is a strategy it's a regenerative strategy, right? It's trying to link risk reduction infrastructure in the form of breakwaters with new cultures, schools, and communities on shore, and rebuilding coastal ecology at the same time. Here's the site on Staten Island. Everything in pink are schools and routes to the waterfront. And this was the zone that Laura mentioned was funded, this REACH, for $60 million by HUD. And the idea is that this is a replicable strategy, right? We're not going to build 600 linear miles of walls around the New York City region, but what we can do is, through the introduction of breakwaters, reduce the velocity of this harmful velocity of the water, help connect people back to the shoreline, and create sort of a calmer, cleaner water environment that people can reconnect to. People are always in the section. Here's the breakwater here in the section. The idea is to develop a culture of resiliency that's made in collaboration with the neighborhood, not a top-down, one-line, monofunctional infrastructure solution. So in our project, we interpreted social resiliency as schools and communities. We self-build a model. This is a model in Staten Island makerspace. People in the community literally kind of helped make it. We had little kids that were charged with actually placing people and animals in this protective cross-section. And it's now at the museum down in Tottenville as a teaching tool. The whole oyster thing went viral because these breakwaters are seeded with oysters, but with the Billion Oyster Project and stewarded by 8th graders in schools up and down the coastline. This is like a news guy. Someone made an oyster hat and brought their own bathing cap to match it. And so I'm just going to go through in the last 5 minutes about how these cycles work. From a risk reduction standpoint, this particular zone in the Outer Harbor is subject to high wave action. Our models showed how the breakwaters can reduce that wave action and create new public opportunities to reconnect and revive recreational economies on shore. And as we move up the coast, you can see how different programs evolve based on the very sort of sensitive and sort of micro reading of that particular territory. From an ecological standpoint, we've gone pretty far, right? This is an urban ecology, but the idea with this project is that ecology is economy, its infrastructure, and its education together. So we designed the breakwater as a sort of structure for juvenile fish and as substrate for oysters. And how do you provide structure for juvenile fish? Well, you create niches in which they can sort of dart into and dart out of. This is the sort of innovation of the breakwater design. We design these things called reef streets, which are literally like social spaces for fish, and to keep the little fish away from the big fish so they can dart in and out of the street and feed in the street and then dart back in and shelter in structure. We're using e-concrete with a recycled glass aggregate. And here's a view of that breakwater and how it has a sort of different can engender different ecologies along its cross-section, from sort of subtidal to intertidal to above waterline. Oysters, I always get the oyster question. Yes, so Staten Island, this entire shelf from Staten Island was once a giant reef, and it was once farmed. So oysters are engineering partners, but they're also a teaching tool and a strategy for engagement of the communities. We engaged schools at the waterfront through the Billion Oysters program, hosted teacher training. We had the students teaching the teachers, which I think is a great idea in this brave new world that we're headed into, provided tools for proliferating the concept, and then are creating hubs and structures where they can host wet labs and classrooms. So I think our biggest advocates for this project were these 8th graders. And I just wanted to close by saying, it is, planning is different. Design is going to have to change. And I think this notion of sort of ground-up planning, the idea of kind of providing tools for others, and that the idea of sort of planning and design students and kind of leading the way in this process is a big way forward. But you have these typical community meetings, right, combined with, more like top-down. This is Chuck Schumer saying living shorelines in his Brooklyn accent. So you need, literally, to make change, there does need to be some coming together of the top-down and the ground-up to make change. So finally, I'll just close with the provocation, which is that, we have to both envision these new energy landscapes, think about decarbonized settlement patterns, and really understand from the point of architecture and design what this means. What does it mean that we can no longer, that there is no non-radical solution? And so I hope that the school is ready to grapple with and act on these issues. Thanks.
Naomi, I'm going to give you the first word to respond because, yeah, okay.
Well,
yeah,
that was an amazing combination of like scary and totally inspiring. So well done. Yeah, I guess I just make a couple quick points let me see if I can read my handwriting.
Yeah, lights, definitely.
Yeah, I was really struck by the image of like that sort of the fossil fuel infrastructure looking like track marks, junky track marks. It was really powerful. Although I do think that, like, the language of addiction, being addicted to fossil fuels, I feel like that's sometimes not helpful. In that, I don't think that we're all addicted to fossil fuels. I think we have politicians who are addicted to fossil fuel money, but most of us would be just as happy or or happier to power our lives if we had good alternatives. It makes it sound like we like, going to Exxon, which, the truth is that most people don't have good choices. New York is a city where people have good transit choices, but most of the country is one that doesn't, And even if they wanted to drive electric vehicles, they don't have charging stations. But yeah, that's such an amazing image. And the you said something about the size of some was it his own weather system or something? It made me think of
the cloud.
The cloud. That image of that pollution cloud that really looks like a natural cloud. Yeah, I would never have known that was a pollution cloud. But it reminded me when we were visiting the Alberta tar sands for this project, we were told that the slag heaps, like just the byproducts of or the overburden, right, as the mining industry describes, forests and soil, that they have these huge slag heaps broken down, like they'll have just massive sulfur mountains, these big yellow sulfur mountains, and we were told by one worker that they actually are so big they have their own weather systems, like you'll see like tornadoes spinning in the slag heaps. And I think this points to something else about why this transition is difficult and also why it's exciting, which is that the deeply inhuman scale of fossil fuel infrastructure, I think also explains the intimate link between an economy built on fossil fuels, such as this one, and income inequality and wealth concentration, right? Because I think it's the nature of this energy source that it is in specific places where you have the deposits. It's really expensive to get it out of the ground, whether it's coal or oil, and it takes heavy infrastructure to refine it, to transport it at every stage. It lends itself to monopoly, to large players, and therefore it also lends itself to concentrated wealth because you're only going to have a few players. So when we think about transitioning to a regenerative-based economy, a renewable-based economy, I think part of the reason why there is so much resistance from not all of, but a big, powerful sector of our elites, and it's not just the oil companies, it's also the banks that finance them, and is that they understand that a renewable-based energy system is never going to deliver those types of concentrated profits because the raw resource is free, right? The wind and the sun and the waves, and it's everywhere, right? So it's decentralized by nature, and so it lends itself to many players. And I read an interesting report by a large utility company that referred to renewable energy, to feed-in tariff models as a system that turns consumers into competitors. Right? Mm-hmm. Because if you have a solar panel on your roof and you are able to feed into the grid, you're not just an energy consumer, you are an energy producer. And that is extremely threatening to a centralized utility that had a monopoly on being an energy producer. Now suddenly you have potentially millions of competitors. So it's not that there can't be a healthy economy, it's a healthier economy, but it isn't going to deliver those super profits.
No, I think that the notion of the dispersal of the energy somehow aligning with a kind of a democratization process is like the way that is somehow a path forward. And I wrote a piece in Huffington Post too, actually about trying to provoke a little more about the notion of new energy landscapes and how we're going to have to change our aesthetic framework about what these landscapes will be comprised of, what these renewable energy landscapes mean for our kind of perception of the world and our perception of nature, right? It's not just like the world is out there and we're somehow, passively receiving, because all these images of like Mossville and Baton Rouge, I mean, these are all landscapes that are often hidden from our view. I think that that's also, a charge for designers, is to kind of push forward and try to understand what these decentralized and renewable systems mean relative to built environment and in a kind of a very literal way, and to kind of lead the charge in describing this brave new world.
Okay, yeah. Before I open it up to the audience, I had a feeling that these guys could keep talking for forever, because it's sort of two sides of the. But I'm interested in the fact that as a journalist, you've taken on this mission of climate change and have found a way to deliver this book, and I'm curious about the ways in which you see it having an impact down the line, because it is a great. It is a great book to explain very complicated things to a different public than the climate scientists are used to talking to. And it's such a. We saw how Kate struggles. It's obvious in her presentation, sort of how she engages. So I'm just curious how a journalistic project like yours does some of the things that Kate is actively publicizing that she's doing.
Mm-hmm. You mean how it? I'm not sure I understand the question. How it
has an impact? Yeah, how it engages in order to have the impact. Kate it's quite clear in Kate's case, a project either succeeds or fails, right? It gets built, or else there's a political backlash against it. And that's very different in the journalistic world, because I think things communicate in a much more dispersed manner. So I'm just curious, some of the stories you have with that, some of the people who stand up and yell at you. They say, you can't fight capitalism. Who are you to fight capitalism? We can't change the clock back. Just a couple of stories.
Well, I mean, yesterday I was at the UN Climate Summit, and I think it's clear, like, even the fact that I was invited to attend this private sector forum with, I mean, I've never been in a room with such high net worth, right? I was seated at a table with Ted Turner and, like, the head of Suez, and, you know, it was like looking around this room, it was CEOs of some of the largest corporations in the world. Some of them were napping. But the head of the World Economic Forum, I caught him napping a few times. But I think, like, I was clearly invited by somebody who wanted me to provoke, like, wanted me to sort of call out some of this as, you know, bullshit, essentially. That's why I was there, you know, to say, okay, like, are we really going to get there through voluntary measures? And I would never have been invited to a forum. Like, I've never been invited to a forum like that before. When I got seated at this table, there were horrified looks. But then later in the day, I was approached by a friend who's head of a very large green group that shall remain nameless, and he just ran up to me and said, "Thank you, you're making us look less crazy." And he said, like, it creates space for us. You're pushing the envelope, you know, and. You know, I've heard that. You know, I've heard that from friends. You know, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace. That, you know, that the groups that have been willing to take on corporate power in various ways, whether through divestment movements, you know, or corporate-based campaigns, that it's just, you know, it's about moving the center a little bit. You know, the center moved really far to the right, and I think one of the things the book does is sort of stake a political pole that's in the other direction, and that opens up some space for different groups. And you know, for me, I mean, I'm on the board of 350, so I'm, you know, it's not like I just talk about this. I was, you know, involved in some of the early discussions around the climate march and Flood Wall Street but for this project in particular, I mentioned the film that goes with it. We've been trying to think in a more deliberate way about how books and films and cultural products can support movements that's, you know, like, I consider large parts of the book to have been directly inspired by social movements, and both in the ideas and obviously in the reporting, and so in concrete ways, it's about creating spaces to elevate those voices. Right. Like at my book launch at the New School on last Thursday, rather than just give a lecture, I gave, you know, a shorter lecture, and then we had a panel of 4 climate justice activists from the global South and North, talking about how this affects their individual struggles. You know, somebody from labor and somebody more on talking about economic justice, and somebody speaking from an indigenous rights perspective. So that's part of the project. And then we're also thinking about, particularly with the film, having more like teach-ins not the best word, but spaces where basically you just use the film as a starting off point to create a space where people from different constituencies who wouldn't normally come together can come together and brainstorm.
I think that would be a great, you know, a great answer to that, is that the book becomes a platform for local engagement. Yeah.
I'm very interested in how projects, specifically, starts with kids and public education. I think climate change is actually one movement children can champion, and I think it's one of the things that in the march on Sunday was noticeable, how many children there were, how smart their slogans are, and how they understand it, and how they are much effective in the same way that the mothers of Plaza de Mayo were very effective, and this is something that I take from Naomi's book, at stopping dictators in South America. Children, I think, are the most effective vehicle for climate change awareness that we have. And so how actively are you pursuing the education of children and the championing of climate change through children education?
Is that a question for me or Kate?
I can speak to that for a second. I mean, I think I showed the letter from the 8th grader for our project, and what was very, I'm sure in your research of your book, there are kind of moments of kind of where you just feel a very difficult, conflicted moment. But one thing that happened during the sort of community outreach, as Owen was saying, was that we met with these 8th graders up and down the sort of coast in a number of different schools, and they kind of had said also that I feel powerless, like I don't know what to do. This happened. Some of them went and lived with the lucky ones, were displaced and lived with their grandparents. The unlucky ones were kind of moved elsewhere, and so I think part of what was helpful for us was to try to frame some of the issues and in ways that were productive and positive, that were educational relative to the level of risk that they literally faced by living in that community of sea level rise and hurricane action and so on, but that also provided some sort of outlet in which that would enable them to be involved and feel like they're kind of, and literally be involved and like literally be part of an educational program that's also seeding this reef and monitoring the reef. So I think that's what we've tried to do is to try to not only just sort of see like teach, if you will, in a kind of a one-way exchange of information, but to try to engender and create conditions in which children can actually be in their own way sort of activists. There's one here. Yeah. I don't know. Okay. All right.
I was just wondering if, on the other hand, how was the oil, gas, and coal industry invited to this affair? And if they haven't, I wonder why, or were they denied it, or whatever, because I doubt if anybody here disagrees with anything that you've said so far.
It's a public event.
Yes,
it's advertised everywhere, so anyone can come.
Yeah. Because I think the school here, I mean, we tend to talk about that term starchitect. We only talk about the architecture in a certain way, and it hardly has ever been a case of bringing out the environment and so forth, and the effect of architecture on the environment like they did in the past. I mean, it's planned communities were talked about and done in the past, and they sort of faded away and so forth, which has all this impact on the environment. But the industry also not being here to give their counterbalance the whole thing and blame it in effect all on the architects and non-planning and all it doesn't, it seems valid to me.
Other questions? Yeah, Mabel.
Both very fantastic presentations, so thank you for sharing your insights, I think, with the audience. I guess my question is, given that this is a global crisis, and the fact that the problem is there are inherent economic and also political inequalities that are out there that prevent a global response. So where can we find those kinds of spaces, and what ways can global connections be made in order to somehow equalize those inequities?
I feel like Naomi answered that question with her.
Since the UN is a kind of mid-20th century phenomenon, that sounds very ineffective. So what new forms or forums can emerge, that can kind of link people globally to educate, but also to somehow act productively?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things what's happening is I think we're increasingly tracing the fossil fuel links globally, where this resistance movement, in the book I call it Blockadia, the resistance movement to new extractive projects, pipelines, coal export terminals. Part of the reason why there is this new wave of climate activism is because we're in the midst of a fossil fuel frenzy at the moment, and it's wider just in terms of sheer territory than anything we've seen before. And part of that's because of fracking, right? Whereas, talking about the thing about coal and oil in the past is that it was really geographically concentrated, but fracking is really wide. It's lots of small holes, right, in people's backyards. And then there's the huge infrastructure projects spanning out from the Alberta tar sands, all these multiple pipeline projects and rail projects and so on. The flip side of this carbon boom is the emergence of Blockadia, the fossil fuel resistance movement, an anti-extractive movement, and it's also becoming global. In where is that coal going? Well, it's going to China. How do people in China feel about the fact that they're sending their kids to school in pollution masks decorated like cartoon characters, right? It's not as if there isn't a debate going on in China right now about the cost of fossil fuels. It's much livelier than the debate that's going on in this country, because it is so immediate, because the air quality is catastrophic in Beijing and Shanghai and other large cities. So I think there are real opportunities, and we should be doing more of that, like more grassroots connection, particularly with China and India. Who's buying the coal? Who's buying that? In Canada, we have these huge fights going on about building pipelines to the west so that tar sands can be it's not just the Keystone XL that's going to the south. It's also there's two pipelines that are being planned to ship oil to China, and the discourse around China is often really regressive, almost like it's almost yellow peril. It's like, oh, we can't get it give this to the Chinese, and they're buying up our oil sands and all of this. And really, what we need to find common ground, because if anything, people in China have an even greater reason to not want the dirtiest fossil fuels being dumped on them because of the air pollution crisis. And the environmental movement in China is stronger than it has ever been in the face of the air pollution crisis. They are shutting down huge numbers of coal refineries. They have a climate law, a national climate law on the books. The U.S. doesn't, So this sort of just kind of blaming China discourse that goes on. What does it matter that what we do? That really needs to be challenged, I think. And one of the ways to challenge that is to build real human connections with the environmental movement and the environmental justice movement in China and other countries. But then I think we just lose a lot of opportunities. And one of the things I write about in the book is this really great proposal that came out of Ecuador to save an incredible it's a national park called the Yasuni. It's part of the Amazon rainforest. It's one of the most biologically diverse parts of the world. They have more species of trees, in 2 hectares than in all of North America that are native to North America. It's also on top of a whole lot of oil. And so there's been this push to drill in the Yasuni. And this group in Ecuador called Acción Ecológica came up with this really cool idea, which was, okay, we don't want to drill in the Yasuni because we want to protect the rainforest. The indigenous people don't want it to be drilled because their water will be poisoned, and they've had a lot of bad experiences with oil spills in the Ecuadorian Amazon. But they do need money, they do need money to develop. They need money for education and schools. And the rest of us, the global community, need that oil to stay in the ground because that's part of stopping climate change. So their proposal was meet us halfway. We will forego half of the profits that we would get if we can be compensated globally for leaving that oil in the ground, basically being carbon keepers in the same way that we, that there were campaigns to save the Amazon in Brazil, and this was a World Heritage Site. So let's recognize that this is it's a global benefit to all of us to keep that oil in the ground, but that the burden of giving up those oil revenues should not all fall on a country like Ecuador. And so they came up with this plan. It was championed by the Ecuadorian government, and our governments didn't pony up. You know, it wasn't that much money. They didn't do it. But I think part of the reason that didn't happen is, with the exception of Amazon Watch, none of the big green groups championed that idea. And there's a lot of, you know, I mean, and all of you know this. There's a lot of sort of censorship that goes on in U.S. political discourse, much of it sort of tacit, around, you know, what will sell and what won't sell, and what you can talk about and what you can't talk about. And the idea of any kind of wealth distribution is essentially considered a non-starter among a lot of liberal environmental groups. So this wonderful proposal, which, you know, could have been extended as a model, really, for a justice-based approach to keeping carbon in the ground, just was languished, and now they're going to go ahead and drill, and, you know, unless some kind of, you know, national uprising stops it. But President Correa in Ecuador has said, look, we gave them a chance. They didn't pony up, and why should we give up all of this income? We're a poor country. It shouldn't be on us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Questions? And this person over here has been waiting for a
Hello, I'd like to thank you for these wonderful presentations. I love them. And in fact, just today in the morning, I visited Dr. Pachauri's presentation on global energy. He's a Nobel Prize laureate, and he said actually a lot of facts which you repeated as well. So basically you have the same kind of opinion, him being a scientist and you being somehow different, maybe activist, journalist, or whatsoever. But I'd like to ask Naomi Klein, please. On the cover of your book, there is capitalism versus the climate. And you talked a lot about China, but their like energy mix on 68% is based on coal. And I'm sorry for being biased, but I come from the former Czechoslovakia, communist country, and they did not absolutely have the clue to solve these ecological issues. So what's your opinion on that? Does there really need to be a contradiction, a political contradiction between leftist or rightist or, you know, capitalism or whatsoever system when it comes to dealing with global climate issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. You know, if the title is read, then we need state socialism, you know, then that's a problem, because as I say in the book, you're absolutely right that the Soviet Eastern Bloc countries had, many of them, including Czechoslovakia, had higher carbon emissions than Canada and Australia until the Soviet Union collapsed. And you know, Mao openly declared war on nature. That was his slogan. And I have a chapter in the book on extractivism, because really I think it isn't just capitalism. It's the mentality of extractivism, this one-way relationship with nature that says we can take and take and take, that we don't need to protect cycles of regeneration, that is at the core. And that the battles of the 20th century between capitalism and socialism were not over whether or not we were going to wage war on nature. It was whether or not, it was how we were going to distribute the spoils, right? And interestingly, that's the debate that's going on in Ecuador right now between Correa, who's a classic developmentalist socialist, who says, I want to dig up the oil and spend it on schools and healthcare, you know, and not a new, because it's drawing on, much of it is drawing on indigenous knowledge, but this is a discourse that talks about the rights of nature, and that wants a non-extractive economy. That doesn't mean we don't extract anything, but we don't create sacrifice zones anymore, that we can have an economic system without sacrifice zones. And that questions the logic of more and more, of endless growth. So I don't see that as the dichotomy. And I use the word capitalism because that is what dominates the world economy. You mentioned China. I think China at this point in history, whatever the governing party calls itself, is. What do you want to call it? Like capitalist Stalinism, but this is a hyper-capitalist economy minus, without the democracy. They've combined the worst of both systems in China. And the emission spike, the global emissions spike, is intimately tied to China's embrace of unfettered export-driven capitalism. Yeah.
Okay, I know there's tons more questions that everybody wants to ask, but we want to make sure, because this is also a book signing, and you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. Both Kate and Naomi are going to sit up there. Oh, no, outside. They're going to sit outside because the room has to be cleared by 2 o'clock. But you can purchase both Petrochemical America and This Will Change Everything up at the top of the auditorium and to the left. So exit through the left.
Thanks.
Okay. That was a great combo, the two of you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen.